Alright guys, Beelum here, back with a new video, and in this video, we're back with another player ranking of a recently finished BB Can season. Here I'll be doing my player ranking for Big Brother Canada 12. A player ranking that is, again, kind of tough to really do here, where we got a lot less information about BB Can 12 than I feel like we got from really a lot of seasons before this, but I'll still be ranking every player on this season based on how I feel like they played on this season. Let's start off at number 14. The person who I think played the worst on this season is actually someone that I don't think played that bad. Straight up, I do think the bottom grouping for this list here is actually better than what you would think it would be, considering obviously a lot of people's criticisms of the season, how it was a steamroll for a lot of it. However, at number 14, the person I'm going to go with here is Janine, the first boot. And again, I think there's some debate here between Janine and the next person we'll be talking about. I think Janine is someone that, while again, is the first boot of the season, someone that went out in a unanimous vote with not much chance to save herself. I think she also gets pretty unlucky in how she gets taken out. One, the fact that, again, she was in a week where only half of the house was even eligibly nominated. Also, she was in a position where she only had a majority alliance at first, being part of the all-women's alliance, though also was in a group that had Spicy V in it. That blew up her spot. And again, I think that's an aspect of her being a bit unlucky. The fact that she was playing against these vets. She was playing against Spicy V, who, again, just ratted her out to Anthony, which, again, the main reason why that was able to happen is because of the connection they had because they were vets and they had a pre-existing relationship before the show. Also, I do think she's unlucky that she was facing off against Anthony, someone that was, again, told of the all-girl alliance and now was willing to stick his neck out to make sure that alliance didn't get too much power. Where, again, a lot of the reason why he even wins this HOH is because he didn't want to let a guy go home. And Theoret gets unlucky in that way, as, again, the only women that were even in her group were her and then the two other women in the Hot Chocolate Alliance. So, again, I think there are definitely things that Janine got very unlucky by. I will say that by the end of the week, I do think she kind of blew some opportunities that she could have utilized. Again, she failed to get Dennis to use the veto on her in a position where, again, I think Dennis would have benefited a lot from using the veto on her. Also, I do think she gets played by the end of the week, and her fully believing into Vivic being the person that backstabbed her when Vivic was actually one of the only people that wanted her to stay, to where, and all that's pretty bad. I do think she's someone that kind of squandered some opportunities, more so the next person we'll be talking about, which is the reason why, again, I have Janine here at the bottom, despite I think there are more arguments for her being higher. Again, the fact that she had an alliance, the fact that I think she gets a bit more unlucky, but again, I think had less potential on this season, so again, that's why she's here at number 14 for me. Now, number 13, we're moving on to a player that, again, I think is very bad in terms of how they played this season, though I don't think it's as bad in the grand scheme of things. Again, I think if they were to play again, maybe there's a lot of potential for this player. Though I also think this player played more optimally than Janine, which is the reason he's higher. At number 13, we do have Dennis. And Dennis is a player that I think plays this season pretty poorly. I mean, like right away, he's someone that is being talked about as a target, someone that had Victoria win that HOH, which again was the plan coming to the HOH comp. I think Victoria probably targets Dennis, and Dennis is probably out week 1. But I think he gets very fortunate by that circumstance, where even beyond that, by the time of week 2, while he is not being targeted during that week, he is clearly on the bottom and someone that is being set up to be targeted the following week. Or coming into week 3, he is the number 1 target on the board, but gets very fortunate in that his number 1 ally in Vivic wins HOH, keeps him safe, only for Vivic to then backstab him and take him out of the game, which again is all very bad. This is all very bad. Again, people will talk about this as, oh, this is just Vivic playing poorly, but like it's also Dennis playing poorly. I mean, Dennis also fails to keep his number 1 in line. He fails to keep his number 1 ally from targeting him, which is insane. And also, bring up the criticism of Dennis winning comps when he didn't need to. Again, him winning that week 1 veto in a position where he was safe anyway. And again, while there was a big move to utilize with that veto, he simply just doesn't do it and just remains at the bottom of the house through doing so. And then in week 2, he wins the veto again, just really upping his threat level. And while again, I think that one was a little bit more excusable. Again, he was someone that was still eligible to be renommed, and also he's able to save Vivic with it and secure his bottom of Vivic. But again, that doesn't last. But again, with that said, I do think Dennis is, again, a pretty competent strategic thinker. I think outside of his gaffe and winning those 2 veto competitions, I think I mostly agreed with his outlook on the game. He had pretty good reads. He, again, had an understanding of the game, and again, was trying to make these moves against Anthony on his way out, to where I think he also puts on a pretty good campaigns pretty much as optimally as he could have, to where, again, I think there is at least some good there at the end from Dennis, to where, while again, I think it's really bad the fact that he's on the bottom for the entire season, was going to be the number 1 target coming to week 3, and even when he gets his best case scenario, he still gets taken out by his number 1 ally. All that is very, very bad, but I also think there's a glimmer of good there. So because of that, for me, he's here at number 13. Number 12, we're moving on to who would have guessed it? We have Vivic. And again, Vivic is just such a strange player to assess on this season. The fact that, yes, he is someone that makes a really dumb move in taking out Dennis, his number one ally. Oh, really bad. But again, like Dennis, I think early on he showed a lot of potential. I think he showed this ability to not fall into the groupthink, being able to be aware of what Anthony is doing in the game and looking at him as a target. The problem is obviously the fact that he fails at doing pretty much anything. He never really has social capital in the game. And by the time week 2, he's the number one target for the entire house, only to be saved by Victoria being Victoria. Though with that said, again, I think he comes into week 3 in an actually decent spot. I don't think people were really coming for him in week 3. And also, even out of his HOH, again, even though he backstabs his number one ally, he also comes out of week 3 not being the number one target on the board. Or again, he would have been safe the entire week had it not been for the executive veto twist. Now, again, the way the executive veto twist plays out is obviously very unfortunate for him. It's a situation where he's being taken out as a direct consequence of what he did to Dennis, though, again, that should not even really happened anyway. Now, again, at the end of the day, Vivic did not have much potential long-term anyway. He probably would have been gone within the next few weeks anyway. But I do think Vivic, again, has some pros here in comparison to Dennis. I think Vivic was able to reintegrate better than Dennis was, to where, again, both were put in these situations where the entire house were against them. Yeah, again, Dennis gets taken out during that week. Vivic actually survives during that week. And again, Vivic essentially gets twisted out of the game to where, again, I think there are a lot of similarities actually between their two games to where, well, again, I think Vivic's move of backstabbing Dennis is obviously much worse than anything Dennis does. I still feel like Vivic has a leg up on Dennis in most other aspects of the game, which is why he's here at number 12. Now, number 11, we're moving on to a player that I don't know what I find tough to assess, as I don't think this person played poorly at all throughout their season, yet just seemed to be disliked by their own group for no real reason, and that person is Donna. And again, Donna is someone that had a majority alliance early on. Again, like Janine was part of the all-girls alliance, and while she wasn't that well positioned within it, again, she at least had this alliance that seemed like they wanted to stick together, though by the time of week 2, again, there's already this tension between her and Lexus, though again, it seemed like that tension was started by Victoria, because Victoria's Victoria, and I guess didn't like Donna to begin with, and just wanted to sink her name anyway, and all that was very strange. And then she actually gets taken out in week 2 in a position where I don't feel like Donna did anything that wrong to cause it. I mean, yes, Victoria was annoyed at how much she was talking to the likes of Todd and Vivic, but again, Donna was actually loyal to Victoria, which to be fair is a fault there, obviously, the fact that she was actually loyal to Victoria and she couldn't convince Victoria of that, but I don't feel like she does that much actively wrong to cause all these things to happen. It just feels like these things happen because Victoria is Victoria and just being a completely illogical player, to where it makes no sense for her game to be doing this, yet she just does it anyway, and it's something that she constantly does throughout the season. I just think Victoria, I mean, as we'll talk about, is just an illogical player. But again, despite that, again, I think she had good relationships in the house. Again, she was somewhat close to staying. Again, her campaign did seem to be effective at a point to where the girls very much doubted whether or not they should have taken her out. And again, that was in a position where they literally backdoored her. They should have no reason to flip that. Yeah, again, they at least considered it, so that's something. Also, again, she had Bayley, she had Dennis, she had Todd in her pocket at that point. She also had a connection with Vivic, to where I think if the votes were there to keep her, I think Vivic would have tried to keep her as well. To where, again, I think there's a lot to like about Donna's game, considering she was the second boot from this season. To where, again, while I do think at the end of the day, again, she still was never able to bond with Victoria, despite being loyal to her, which is, again, a fundamental issue with her game. I feel like the way she plays the game around that is not necessarily bad. And I think she had some more long-term potential, more so than the likes of Dennis and Vivic. So again, for me, I have her here at number 11. Now, number 10, we're moving on to a player that is, again, just another very strange one to assess. As someone that I think plays probably more suboptimally than someone like Donna, that obviously makes it further than her. Though kind of like her, was assumed to be in the majority alliance, that was never really someone that the people in that alliance were loyal to, and that person is Elijah. And again, Elijah is someone that, again, was in the Directors Alliance. The Directors Alliance was the assumed majority alliance for the early portions of the season, only for it to just not be. Obviously, it was more so this expansion of the Hot Chocolate Alliance, and Elijah was someone that was just used as a pawn within that alliance, where, again, despite him being aligned with Victoria, she instantly nominates him as a pawn, and he just really felt like this very expendable number throughout a lot of the game. And again, it's in a position where, again, he ends up allowing Victoria to put him on the block. Again, she gives him an out and asking him if he'll be okay with that, and he just says yes. And even while on the block, he does actively campaign for a backdoor plan to happen, even if he's not the one taken off the block, and that's suboptimal play, as it just obviously opens up the opportunity for the person that is the replacement to stay over you in positions where, again, it should have been very clear that he would have stayed if it was him versus Vivic on the block. And again, in week 2, again, he pretty much gets saved there by the fact that Anthony gets this Dennis plan to go through, as otherwise Elijah would have definitely been in a lot of danger there. He obviously wins the week 4 HOH. In a position where, again, he probably would have been the pawn again had that not been the case. And again, would have been a very small number to be taken out there. And even during his HOH, he kind of blows up his game. To where, again, I think he makes some suboptimal plays. Again, I think targeting Bayley is not necessarily bad, but the way he does it by putting up Tola and Todd is just unnecessary. The way he finally finds out that he's being played, but then proceeds to confront the people that he's being played by and making it very aware that he's against them now. Again, all that's very poor play, making him a clear target for the following round. And again, he's in this position where he's the number 1 target coming into week 5. And while, again, he ends up staying that week, I don't think it's due to anything that Goose actually did himself. And it's more so just due to the fact that other people were bigger threats than him. And beyond that, I think, again, by the time of his actual eviction, he was just such an expendable number. No one really cared about where he was in the game, and he was just taken out as an easy person to take out. Now, I do think there is at least some argument for this person being above the person we will be talking about following this, in the fact that Elijah made further than that person. Also, the fact that Elijah kind of gets a bit screwed in the game by the time he goes out. Against a very wonky situation there of it not being a proper round of gameplay. But still, I think Elijah is someone that just had no real potential in the game. I think even if he did stay in the game, he had no real shot at winning the game, and someone that made a lot of strategic errors in the game as well. So again, for me, he's here at number 10. Now, number 9, we're moving on to a player that I don't think does as much wrong as Elijah, though was in a very similar position in the game, but I think is probably just the better player of the two, and that person is Matthew. And Matthew, again, technically goes out next to Elijah. Elijah does outlast Matthew in the game. However, I think Matthew was, again, better positioned for long term. I think he's someone that is, again, taken out in a 4-3 vote. He had 3 solid numbers for him. Again, 3 locked in numbers. Again, he had a very close relationship with Anthony and with Tola. He obviously had his showmance with Lexus. Again, he had a lot of numbers in the game. The problem is that he's such a passive player, to where I don't think he really brought in his horizons much beyond that. It didn't seem like he had that much of a connection to the women of his alliance outside of Avery. And even then, Avery's convinced to take him out by the end of that week. And really, I just don't feel like he had much potential to even stay that week, even though he was, again, only 1 vote away from staying that week. Now, outside of that, again, his game is similar to Goose, just better positioning. He is in the Director's Alliance, though he is, again, safer in the game despite that. Now, there is a lot of talk about taking him out throughout a lot of the game, largely because, again, his connections to Anthony and Lexus, to where he's just an easy person to target to weaken them, but none of those early shots actually go through. Or again, he has a strong enough relationship with Elijah, where Elijah does end up telling him that he's being targeted. Again, he's able to keep himself off the block in these situations where Elijah is continuously nominated. So where, again, I think Matt is essentially just a step above Elijah, even though Elijah stays longer in the game. I think Matt is better positioned for long term. I think he's someone that if he had stayed in the game and had made it all the way to the end, I think there's at least more potential of him winning the game. I also think he's just in general a more well-rounded player. I think he's someone that was more affable socially, someone that was not as chaotic strategically, and someone that would just in general be better at competitions. Where I think Matthew is someone that is more catered towards the typical BB Can style competitions, where again, this did have a bit of a paradigm shift in terms of competitions to where they were made a lot more equitable, which I do think kind of harmed Matthew to a degree. But I think Matthew, again, not a great player in the grand scheme of things, but again, of the people we talked about so far, I think he definitely had the most potential long term in the game, at least being in an actual alliance that did maintain some control for a little bit of the game. So again, because that for me is here number 9. Now number 8, and here we're moving on to a player that made it much further in the game. I mean, this is someone that almost made it to the very end of the game. However, I do think their game itself is not particularly great, with them getting locked out in many situations, even though I think there's also some minor things to praise them for as well, and that player is Todd. And Todd is a player that obviously came into the game not really knowing anything about Big Brother, did not know what he was doing, and I think you can very much tell that at the very beginning of the game. Again, it feels like he's simply just there without having many connections in the game. While he does have some bonds with the likes of Bayley and Donna and Vivic and Dennis, none of them really correlated to an actual alliance. He's kind of just coasting in the game for the first few rounds, being looked at as just a very expendable number in the game, and someone that was obviously just not targeted due to the fact that there's just other more threatening players in the game, with the likes of Dennis and Vivic, who were targeted early on. And obviously we have the move against Donna, which was pretty much his number 1 ally at that point. who gets taken out so early. Though again, I think by the time of week 5, I do think he actually starts playing the game somewhat well. He does do good work in Camp Elijah as a number, to where had Elijah not been sniped out the movie Night Massacre, again, I think that could have been a very integral number for him. He obviously has his connection with Tola, to where at that point, again, he orchestrates the move against Kayla at the movie Night Massacre, and I think that's something you gotta give him credit for as well. The problem is, I think after that, he kind of just stops really doing that much in the game, to where while he is there, and again, he's working alongside Bayley, he has a tight bond with Victoria at that point, and Victoria is continuously trying to save him in the game. Mind you, due to the work that Bayley put in, not really due to the things that Todd did, but still, I mean, like, he is being kept around in the game with some people on his side, but isn't really doing that much to actively position himself in the game. And by the time of the final 7, again, he was someone that his own allies, outside of Bayley, were trying to throw in their bus as the most expendable number of them, and he obviously goes on a comp run towards the end of the game that seems to gain him a bit more respect from the jury, to where, again, it did seem like for a lot of the season that he was the biggest GOAT on the board. I do think by the time he gets voted out, he actually wasn't as much of a GOAT, simply just due to the fact that, again, people seem to respect his veto wins, which, again, don't mean much to me, but again, they mean something to the players themselves. Though, again, I do think his overall pitch to Lexus on his way out was not particularly great. I feel like that's a situation where he had a lot more ammunition to use against Anthony and didn't really do it, even though, again, at the end of the day, I do think Lexus probably would have still voted him out even if he did. And again, like, all in all, with Todd's game here, I do think if it was just everything I talked about up to this point, I think his game is fine. Like, it probably would have been enough to put him at least one spot higher on the list, but the reason why he is lower than specifically the next person that we'll be talking about is because of week 4, which was a situation where he was 100% saved by the executive veto. Now, straight up, I think he gets very unlucky to be in the situation that he was in that week, where, again, the actual target for that round was Bayley, but due to the worry that Matt would potentially go on the block, Lexus doesn't use the veto, and that leads to Todd being stuck on the block against Tola, again, in a position where he would have gone home. But again, it was a pretty unlucky situation that got him there to begin with, but again, he was gonna go home. He was literally on his way out had that executive veto not been used. And I do think really a lot of the reason why it ends up being used is not really because of much that Todd did on his own, but more so just because Victoria is Victoria. So again, I essentially look at him as someone that was saved by a twist, and in a position where he would have gone home against someone that is the next person we'll be talking about. So where, again, that's the reason why I do have Todd a bit lower here at number 8. Now, number 7, we're moving on to a player that, again, I don't look as that good, but again, at least he was going to stay over Todd, even though, again, he goes out before Todd. But again, for me, at number 7, I do have Tola. And again, Tola is just a weird player on this season. The fact that I don't really feel like Tola did much that well on this season. I mean, while I do think he did a good job at building a bond with Anthony, to where Anthony looked at him as a loyal soldier and wanted to carry him through the game. And again, Anthony did do very effective work in carrying him through the game. I don't feel like Tola did that much on his own. Again, he's essentially like the Todd of his side. I mean, probably a little bit better position than that, in the sense that I think Anthony had a bit more loyalty to Tola than Victoria did to Todd, but still, I do feel like Tola was just kind of on the lower end of his side of the house, where, again, like, it was one where Anthony had a close bond with Matt and with Lexus, and Tola was kind of on the bottom of that grouping, though as a whole, like, Tola's game is just very up and down. Again, early on, he was in a particularly bad spot where a lot of the women wanted to target him week 1, and he probably would have been targeted had not been for the fact that Anthony was the HOH in a position where he wanted to protect the men of the house, knowing that there's an all-girls alliance, and a lot of that came from his own sloppy play of letting it be known to the girls that he knows that there's a girls alliance. And after that, he's just this pretty perpetual pawn, someone that's easy to put on a block. They have an easy excuse, proving the fact that they could say that we need you to win the veto, when in reality, he would have been in a lot of danger had he stayed in the block in certain situations. Again, the week 4 eviction where he was on the block against Todd, while I do think Todd would have gone home, again, it would have been a pretty tight one where essentially Tola is 100% being saved by Anthony's influence in the game, where a lot of the women did just want to vote him out or weren't willing to do so because they were worried about burning their relationship with Anthony. Now, again, like Todd, I do think he does some decent work at the movie Night Massacre, and again, actually trying to put together a move against the other side, where while it doesn't go through, and again, they kind of fumble the bag in their explanation of the move, I do at least respect the fact that they at least attempted to make a move there. Now, at final 5, again, I do think Tola probably would have been booted that week had he not won the veto, where obviously we see him win and Matt go on the block, and again, I think it's actually an easier sell for them to take Tola out of the game at that point, where again, I think Tola would have been pretty screwed had he stayed on. He again was on the block and the final 8 round. Where again, had the veto not been used in that spot, he probably goes home, though again, it's a bit wonky. But again, he proceeds to win HOH and target Avery in a spot where I don't even think that's really his best move, as I think he probably should have just taken the shot at Victoria at that point. That upsets the power structure a lot more. Only to obviously be taken out the double. And again, it's kind of just a weird game to me. It's one where, again, he does have a solid grouping of allies in Anthony, Lexus, and Matt throughout a lot of the game, though in reality, those people had other allegiances in the game, and he was kind of just a tag along for them until it became convenient for him to not be that. And even beyond that, I do feel like he was someone that would have been in a lot of danger had certain comp results went the other way. Though, again, in comparison to someone like Todd, again, I do look at their games very similar. And while I do think Todd obviously outlasts Tola, I do think he shouldn't have outlasted Tola, where again, Todd would have probably been out in week 4, literally against Tola, had the executive veto not been used. To where, considering that, and also the fact that it did seem like some people had some respect for Tola by the time he left the game, to where had he gotten a comp run, I do think he would have been a possible winner in that spot and would have had more respect than someone like a Todd. I do feel like it's enough barely to put him here number 7. Now number 6, and now we're getting to some of the better players of the season. I do feel like this top 6 are people that were actually involved in a lot of what happened during their runs in the game, even though we're still at some players that have deep flaws. And number 6, we're starting all that off with Kayla. And Kayla is a player that I do find pretty interesting in the fact that she was obviously in the majority alliance for a lot of her run. She was alongside V and Avery and being part of the core of the Hot Chocolate Alliance, and also having the connections with the women. Also just in general being involved in a lot of alliances. Again, they had the directors, they had the alliance with Vivic, and Kayla definitely had a lot going on earlier in the game, to where I think Kayla was probably the best positioned person in the game during those first few weeks. Someone that, again, was not being targeted by anybody, one that had a lot of personal connections, though also one that I think was a bit too loyal to Hot Chocolate. And I do think that is probably the biggest downfall for Kayla as a player on this season, is I do think she was probably the most gung-ho on wanting Hot Chocolate to succeed, despite the fact that Hot Chocolate was such a fractured alliance that was never going to hold, and in a position where she was pretty much on the bottom of that power structure unknowingly, where again we know Anthony did a lot of good work early on in trying to sewer Kayla's name to V, to where it's a lot of the reason why V ends up actually making the move to take out Kayla by the time she goes home. And even beyond that, by the time the mid portion of the game, again, she was being looked at as the biggest target of the Hot Chocolate Alliance, where we see, again, Todd and Tola talk about taking the shot at Kayla. And even before that, I think she makes moves that are not necessarily in her best interest, which really goes for the entire women grouping there. But again, like taking out someone like Elijah, and even considering it before he actually goes home, is again not particularly beneficial for her. Again, Elijah was someone that thought he had a final 2 with Kayla and did want to work with her down the road. Obviously making the Matt move, while I do think it is probably best for Kayla of her, Avery, and V, I do still think it's a move that can just completely burn trust with Lexus, someone that she did genuinely want to take further into the game. And also, it's a move that was only necessary because of how much she sewered her relationship with Matthew to begin with, that made him want to target her first of the women, to where really, again, I feel like Kayla's game is just a very sloppy one. It's one where, again, in comparison to the people we talked about so far, she definitely was in the majority group and was an active participant in what was going on during the first half of the game, much more so than anyone we've talked about so far. Again, being extremely well positioned early on, though, again, I think takes out her own numbers along the way, burns relationships that she didn't need to, and again, remained too loyal to Alliance that wasn't loyal to her, to where, while I do feel bad for her on her way out, that she's being taken out by people making these proactive lies about her, it's still due to her own poor play that people believed those lies. Or again, sloppiness of not telling Victoria that Elijah told him that Victoria is the biggest threat on his way out. Yet telling most other players in the house is, again, just really bad play there, and really just opened the door for Viva believing everything that Anthony and Lexus said, to where I think as a whole, again, a sloppy game. Still definitely some upsides here, but not enough to be here higher than number 6. Now number 5, we're moving on to a player that also played a very sloppy game. There was definitely a much more consistent presence early on in the game, though I think their game at the end unravels a lot more than Kayla's does. But at number 5, we're going to go with Avery. And again, Avery for me is a player that is essentially very similar to Kayla early on. Again, she is working alongside Kayla and Victoria. They're really running a lot of the show. Now, I think there are some pros and some cons for Avery early on. I think pros in the fact that I think she's a bit more of a stable presence, where really that's the vibe I always got from Avery early on, is that she's probably the most rational strategic thinker of the trio and would kind of try to make them think rationally, particularly in the Donna blind side, where Avery was gung-ho about, okay, we need to make sure Donna goes home once she's on the block. block while the other two wavered, which, I mean, to be fair, the fact that they're getting rid of Donna to begin with is stupid, but once you make the move, again, to go back on it would be even dumber. We have her fighting against the Matthew blindside plan and wanting it to be Tola instead, which again is a much more optimal move for her. Problems, though, are one, I do think early on she was not as well positioned as Kayla. I feel like Kayla had more individual bonds, was included more groups, though. Again, Avery was still pretty well positioned. And to be fair, Victoria was definitely way more loyal to Avery than she ever was to Kayla. But really the big negatives for her really start with her HOH reigns, particularly the end result of her first one. Again, like taking the shot at Matthew is just something that I really do not agree with. It's a move that she personally especially did not need to make. Again, Matthew is someone that was close to Avery, did not want to go after Avery, and it's a move that she even recognized was not the move that she should be making, though again went through with it because Victoria told her what to do. And I do think that's kind of the frustrations with Avery's game towards the back portion of it, is that it does feel like she kind of relents in essentially just deciding to do whatever Victoria tells her to do, where again, obviously, eventually taking out Kayla is just astronomically bad, again, completely sinking her game in that instance, giving more power to the Anthony side of the house. Now, again, in terms of the comparison to Kayla, obviously, I think the things that are better, the fact that she takes out Kayla, she's at least survives further than Kayla, which again, obviously the move to take out Kayla in itself was very, very bad, but again, at least she does make it further than her, is part of her downfall. Beyond that, obviously she wasn't targeted against Kayla, where again, she was literally on the block against Kayla during the movie night massacre, and had Nam stayed the same, Kayla was going home there. And we even see her staying against Elijah, which is actually pretty insane that that's even the case. Which again, at that point felt like a complete half measure, to where, while I think she completely drops the ball at the very end of her game, I do think the rest of her game, again, is pretty solid. Again, it's her sticking with this majority group, a majority group that she does have some agency within early on, even though again it feels like she relents that by the end. But also like Avery, if she got to the end, especially against someone that wasn't Victoria, I think she's a pretty likely winner, to where I think there's definitely pros to be had here, to where while I definitely disagree with a lot of decisions she made towards the back portion of her game, I think at the beginning of the game she was a pretty rational thinker and someone that definitely demonstrates some pretty strong play at points, to where again it's enough for me to land her here, number 5. Now number 4, moving on to a player that I think definitely got underestimated on this season, someone that has some detractors online, along with definitely people on the jury that did not respect this person, though I think at the end of the day is a player that I actually think is pretty decent, even though again definitely have some major issues with them. But either way, at number 4 I do have Lexus, and Lexus is a player that I think did well considering the hand she was dealt. Again, she was in a position where, again, yes, she was involved in the Hot Chocolate Alliance, and that should have been this very powerful position. Again, Hot Chocolate obviously ran a lot of the early portion of the game, yet despite that, she was someone that was kind of kicked out of that alliance. It was not someone that was genuinely included within that grouping, where like Kayla and Avery and Victoria never really trusted her from the very beginning. Where again, we see Victoria openly not trusting her at the very first digital daily that we even got from day one, to where I think Lexus just naturally did not gel with someone like Victoria for whatever reason, to where we could say it's an issue with Lexus's game. I do think it's still something that Lexus didn't do that much wrong to cause it. For a while, again, later on, Victoria later claimed that, oh, it's because she was just tied up with Matt that made us want to go against her. Again, that's simply not true. She was already being targeted from the beginning. So again, I think there are some initial biases against her, to where the people within the core group did not really want to work with her. And considering that hand that she was dealt, I think she played extremely well. Again, she was able to navigate through the entirety of the game all the way to Final 3 in a position where she still had a winning scenario at the end. Again, she was able to pivot her game, and where again, initially she was very loyal to the women of Hot Chocolate, though Ozzy Nay never showed her any loyalty back, and through that she was able to build her new coalition. Again, have good relationships with the likes of Matt and Tola and Anthony, to where obviously Matt is eventually taken out. But once that happens, again, I think she positions herself in the game pretty impressively, to where while she is talked about as a target during Avery's second HOH reign, again, it is her connection with Anthony that really keeps her in the game. She built this bond with Anthony, to where Anthony goes all out to blow up Hot Chocolate and take out Kayla. So that alone, I don't think is really enough to truly prop up Lexus, to where had it been just all Anthony, it's not really enough to look at her too highly, though again, Lexus definitely plays a role in getting Kayla on the block. Again, something that Lexus does very well across the season is really enacting a lot of Anthony's strategies, where again, during Anthony's 2 big moves towards the end of the game and taking out Kayla and taking out Victoria, Lexus is a pretty big role in both of those. And we do see Lexus going to Victoria and straight up just lying to her about what Kayla said, and later lying directly to Kayla's face about what she said, and is able to sell these lies. That is really impressive there. Now, obviously, at the end of the day, is Kayla the best target for her? Probably not. But again, in a situation where it's her or Kayla, again, I think she plays that situation pretty well. And again, going to the Spicy Week, I think that's also some really impressive play, where, again, I think there definitely are qualms we had with her just being so willing to go on the block that week, which obviously would have put her in a lot of danger had comps played out in a specific way. Though, again, I think in the way that it did play out, again, I think there's some very good play there. I think she does a lot of really good management of Bayley and Todd, keeping them in line, making sure they don't flip back, keeping them informed and everything that Spicy V is saying. And through that, again, it really allows that plan to go through. And now, again, a lot of people did criticize her Final Four move to take out Todd. I personally don't. Again, I still think the move was to keep Anthony in the game. And obviously, again, the move would have been to maintain Anthony's loyalty, which she wasn't able to do. But I still think the optimum move is to keep Anthony. Because, again, I think Anthony's someone that she beats at the end. And even beyond that, Anthony's more likely to take her to the end than Todd at either than one final age. And also, with Anthony there, makes it more likely that Bayley takes her to the end than Todd. To where, again, I think overall, I just 100% disagree with Lexus taking out Todd at Final Four being a bad move for her. Though I will say, issue with her game that I think becomes abundantly clear by the end game is the fact that I do think she's a bit too loyal in the game. I do think something about Lexus, the fact that I think she's obviously very hung up on loyalty, and through that would have taken Anthony to the end in a situation where, again, she beats him, but she didn't know that. She thought she was going to lose to Anthony. She thought Anthony was the biggest jury threat on the board. So her really wanting to go to the end of the Anthony, despite that, again, is questionable. Now, she has said in Exit Press that her final decision would have been a tough one, that she isn't 100% sure on which side she would have gone with, though she does think she would vote take Anthony to 2. But again, it did seem like she was very hung up on wanting to be an honest and loyal player, which, again, I think that being the basis around a lot of her endgame decisions is what makes it a bit questionable. As, again, I think if it wasn't for that, I think the moves that she was making were just outright the best moves for her game. But again, I think there definitely is the qualm of the fact that she wasn't able to keep Anthony in line at the final 3. Again, the fact that she wasn't able to get Anthony to take her to the end and not recognize that Bayley was the bigger jury threat, though, too fair, again, no one in the house recognized that Bayley was the bigger jury threat. I don't think Bayley even recognized that she was the biggest jury threat. But still, again, when her and Anthony were working in lockstep for a lot of the game, and also she literally just saves him the previous round for her to not even be able to him to repay that loyalty, I think it's pretty bad on her end. But again, I still think as a whole, she is a very competent player, and she's able to enact these plans that Anthony laid out pretty flawlessly. So obviously, in comparison to Avery and Kayla, she obviously makes it further than both of them. I think in comparison to Avery, I don't think she has as dumb of a move as Avery does, and also is, again, able to trick Avery into making that move. In comparison to Kayla, again, it was directly a battle between her and Kayla, and she outplays Kayla. To where, considering that and the fact that, again, she has a winning scenario, I think she outright beats Anthony, mind you, in a closer vote than what Anthony had against Bayley. But again, I still think she does beat Anthony with the votes of the Hot Chocolate women plus Tola at minimum. But also, definitely possible that she gets Bayley and Todd, to where, again, I think Lexus has a pretty competent game here all around. But while I definitely have issues with her being so loyal of a player, I think her game is pretty solid, and that's why she's here at number 4. Now number 3, and at number 3, we're moving on to a player that I don't really know what to do with this person, as this is a player that played an extremely dominant game on this season, was in a power position for a lot of the season, yet I think plays this season all wrong. But I think the fact that they were in such a dominant position for as long as they were is enough to put them this high. And at number 3, we do have Victoria. And again, Victoria is a player that is just so bad at the game. I think Victoria is a terrible Big Brother player, but she got her best case scenario on this season. I think she really ran the show for the majority of the season. She was in a dominant position from the very beginning. She was really the main decision maker throughout most of the game. Mind you, those decisions were being given to her by numerous sources, almost none of them being actually in her best interest. Where I think the interesting thing about Victoria is that while she was running the game from the very beginning, I think she very rarely makes a decision unpromptedly. It feels like she's always making a decision because someone convinces her to do so, whether that be Anthony, whether that be Bayley. And when she is making a move kind of independently on her own, it's a terrible move. Again, her ratting out the All Girls Alliance to Anthony, that just makes Anthony want to target them, leading to Janine being the first boot. Her outwardly just taking out Donna for no reason, despite Donna being extremely loyal to Victoria. You have her really wavering on whether or not to keep Dennis, and talking about potentially wanting to keep Dennis to take out Anthony, which is bad for her game. Her fighting really hard to try to keep Todd in the game really throughout a lot of the season, but even in week 4, which is Seward's relationship with Anthony, in a position where, again, like, what is Todd to her in the game? She has no real connection with Todd, and then she does build a connection with him through using the executive veto on him, but still, Todd is just not that important of a number to her. where she has so many other options, yet is really just going all in on Todd, which again, from the executive veto on, I think this is the point where Bayley is the main influence in Victoria's ear. Bayley is the one that's able to get Victoria to do a lot of what she does from that point forward, which again are not good moves for her, despite the fact that she is still running the game. But again, her saving Todd and taking out Vivic really just sewers trust with her other allies in the game, and also, again, taking out Vivic was bad for her considering Vivic was actually loyal to Spicy at that point. Her leading the charge against Matthew the following week, also really bad. Obviously completely sinking her relationship with Lexus, again, furthering pissing off Anthony, and also weakening her own power structure. Again, all to keep Todd in the game, only for Todd the following week to then organize a plan against Kayla, which would have also sunk her power structure. What do you know? The following week after that, Victoria sinks her own power structure. She gets tricked by Anthony into thinking that Kayla was against her really the entire season, and that had been something that Anthony had been setting up for a while. But again, despite Kayla actually being loyal to V, at least for the short term, again, I do think by the tail end of the game, I think Kayla would have flipped on V, but again, definitely not for a while. And for Victoria, again, to get Avery to backdoor Kayla in this spot is truly asinine, where again, it's just her taking out her numbers one by one. And obviously we get the following week where, because her power structure now doesn't have the numbers, what do you know? She loses her other closest ally in Avery. And along the way also puts a vote onto Bayley, again, just pissing off Bayley for no reason, only for her to do what Bayley wants her to do during the double and take out Tola, which completely sinks her relationship with Anthony, where obviously Anthony targets her at the final 5. And in that spot plays extremely sloppily. Again, just telling both sides what they want to hear in a spot where they're both talking to each other and just ratting her out at every instance. We have her obviously terrible campaign to where she spends all of her time campaigning to Anthony, despite the fact that Bayley and Todd are the deciding votes in that situation. Even wasting time campaigning to Lexus for no reason. Again, all this is just so bad. Now again, the pros for Victoria is, again, she did have a lot of control in the game. And really, up until the Kayla vote, she had near full control in the game, but she does everything wrong with that control. Again, she should have had such an easy ride in the game. She was in a perfect position early on in the game. She could have done nothing in the game and really run the show from beginning to end. Again, she was in so many alliances. She was at the top of every single one of those alliances. Yet for some reason, she just blows up all those alliances along the way. And again, it feels like a position where she was kind of given that power structure. Again, it feels like the way that the season was structured early on and through specific people cast. Again, she was always going to have this large grouping around her early on in the game, only for it again just completely sink that for no reason. Now again, the other major pro for her is the fact that she had a lot of win equity. I think if she gets to the end against anybody, I think she does win. But again, when she does everything wrong around that, I simply don't think this is a good game. I think Victoria plays a pretty bad game on this season, despite the fact she has so much control on this season. Yeah, it is the fact that she does have so much control on this season that makes me have to land her here at number 3. Now number 2, and now we're moving on to obviously a big debate here. I think this is definitely a tough debate. Again, we obviously have the final 2 of the season as the top 2 here, which I think there are pros and cons to both of these games. I think both of them are actually pretty strong games. However, at number 2 here, I am going to go with the winner of the season. I'm going to go Bayley. And again, I think it's close. For me, it's close between Bayley and Anthony. I think the main reason I would have Bayley lower, though, is because I do think her game is a lot less consistent. I think Bayley's game, again, as a whole, is very good. I think by the time she wins the season, I think there are a lot of pros to her game. However, I think her early game is definitely very rocky. Again, she's being targeted a lot early on in the game. She doesn't really know what's going on in the game during the early portion of the game. Again, she is part of the Big Sister Alliance, yet that was never a proper real alliance. Again, the true alliance was Hot Chocolate, and that was happening around her. Even Directors was more of a real alliance at that point, and again, it was something she was completely unaware about. And again, early on, her side is getting shots taken at her. Again, Janine goes home week 1, someone that was in her alliance. Donna, her closest ally, gets taken out week 2. In a position where she creates an enemy out of Vivic, is already being targeted by a lot of the other men. And again, was the target week 3, and again, potentially would have gone home had Nam stayed the same. Again, not necessarily, but definitely a chance of that. But again, Dennis goes home that week, something that she did not want to happen. Week 4, she was once again the target there. And while Elijah, again, creates a dumb plan of trying to backdoor her, and she never actually hits the block, again, she was the target during that week. However, I think it is towards the end of that week where her game completely flips. I think from the point of the executive veto on, I think her game actually becomes pretty good, which again creates this big dichotomy. I think the beginning of her game, again, is very, very rough, with her, again, being being completely unaware of the game that's going on around her and kind of being saved by the fact that she is so blindly loyal to Spicy V. Yet, again, I think from Executive Veto on, she starts to actually have influence with Spicy V, which I think leads to her playing a solid game at that point. Again, getting Spicy V to keep Todd in the game is something that is very impressive in my mind. And the fact that she even gets Todd all the way to Final Four is purely insane. When Todd is someone that was such an expendable number for the majority of the house, yet she was able to convince Spicy V that he wasn't expendable. Now again, a lot of that comes from Bayley's own delusions of the fact that she did not really know what was really happening in the game, and through that she was thinking that what was good for her game was also good for Spicy's game because she thought Spicy was in the same position as her when Spicy was not in the same position as her. But she was able to convince Spicy that she was in the same position as her, which again makes this all very strange. It is a very tough thing to assess with Bayley's game, and the fact that despite her not being aware of what was going on in the game, she was able to convince Spicy to think of the game in the way that she was thinking about the game. And Spicy shouldn't be thinking about the game in that way. So again, she goes so far away to keep Todd safe in week 5 as well, and take out Matthew, a move that again, is only good for Bayley. And it completely disrupts the Directors Alliance, also causes havoc within the Hot Chocolate Alliance, which again, Bayley didn't know was happening, but again, it definitely benefits Bayley. Now again, by the time of the final 8, again, she was being targeted again at that point by Kayla, though again, that seemed to be a plan that was never really going through, where by that point she had become one of Spicy's closest confidants, and obviously again, we have the game kind of being played around her, of Anthony convincing E to take out Kayla, and then Bayley eventually being convinced of that being the right thing for her as well, because it was the right thing for her. But again, that's another position where I wouldn't give her that much credit. But again, by that point in the game, I think she does some very good social work. And the fact that she does build a bond with Anthony, to where again, I think one of the most impressive aspects of Bayley's game is the fact that she was able to build this bond with Anthony. Having these connections to both Spicy and Anthony that really protected her in the game, which I think was a very active decision from her. Again, her recognizing the fact that the vets were not going to go home early and have a lot of influence in the game, and through that built connections with both of them so they both take her deep into the game. And again, I think that's a very impressive aspect of Bayley's game, to kind of wedge her in the middle of these returning players, being pretty much the only player to have the loyalty of both of those returning players. Mixing out the fact that, again, despite the fact that she is a very confrontational figure, which can definitely cause her some trouble in the game, I think she also utilized that to her benefit. I think the fact that she was so honest with what she was thinking led to people, again, respecting the fact that she was honest in the game, but also led to deeper connections with people. Again, I think that's another aspect of Bayley's game that is pretty impressive. But again, we see it once again, pretty impressive play at the time of the double eviction, again, getting Spicy to do exactly what she wants, going right to her at the very beginning and getting her to go against Tola, and stopping Anthony and Lexus from convincing her to not put Todd on the block. Again, all that very impressive play. But then we get to Final 5, which I think is an interesting spot in the game. Obviously, it's one where she does make the move to go against Spicy, a move that I do question if it's in her best interest. Now, obviously, it works out for her. Yeah, I do think there's definitely a world where she should have kept Spicy in the game at that point. While Spicy was the biggest jury threat on the board, Spicy was also the biggest target on the board, to where, for Bayley in particular, I think there's definitely an argument that she should have kept Spicy in the game, where Spicy would have gone after Anthony, and obviously she never had a connection to Lexus, and very unlikely that Lexus would have taken her to the end. So again, I think that's definitely a move that I do question, though the fact that she was finally out of the spell of just being blindly loyal to Spicy and recognize all these things weren't adding up. I think the fact that she was able to shift course is pretty impressive play there, along with the fact that, again, by the time of the Final 4, we see her really being on board with taking Todd to the end, where she would have easily won. Again, a situation where, again, like, I think it's really insane that she was even able to get Todd to 4, along with the fact that, again, the fact that she had Anthony in her back pocket as well. Though, again, I think that's another spot where, again, it's questionable that she wants to get rid of Anthony at 4. I don't think that's the best move for her. I think the move would have been Lexus. Again, I think taking out Anthony just opens up the road for Lexus taking Todd at the Final 3, throw it in a position where, again, I think Anthony would have taken Bayley no matter what at that point. Again, still questionable moves there for sure, but again, she's still able to convince Anthony to take her to the Final 2 over Lexus, which is pretty insane. And oh well, she's the biggest jury threat on the board. Now, I will say there's definitely some lack of awareness in that, where again, while a lot of people will criticize Anthony for his lack of awareness of not realizing that Bayley was the biggest jury threat and that he should have taken Lexus, there's also a lack of awareness from Bayley's end as well. I don't think many people will mention, as obviously it's not as bad of a misread, but Bayley also was very unaware of her jury prospects. She very much thought Anthony was the biggest jury threat on the board, which is simply just not the case. And it's a complete misread of how the jury was feeling about Anthony on his way out. To where, again, while I do think it isn't as bad especially when you're someone like Bayley, who is the biggest jury threat on the board at that point, to where really none of it really matters in terms of who you get to the end with. It obviously does matter in terms of positioning, to where, again, I think that's what led to her wanting Anthony out at 4, which actually was not a good move for her game. But again, she just beats everybody at the end. Again, from the point that Spicy V leaves the game, she is the wide front runner to win the game. Even against Spicy, I actually think it would have been a somewhat close vote. Where again, I think Bayley's win equity is very impressive. I think there are many points in the game where she does have influence in spots where she simply shouldn't. I think that is impressive. I think her overall just game strategy throughout a lot of the season is very impressive. Of how she attached herself to the vets and actually got them to be, at the end of the day, more loyal to her than they were to each other. Where again, I think there's a lot of impressive play from Bayley. For a while, again, I definitely qualm with some strategic decisions she makes. I also qualm with some lack of awareness she has of her game. I think there's still a lot of impressive play from Bayley, especially considering the hand she was dealt. Again, the fact that she wasn't in this big majority alliance early on and that she was able to crawl her way through that, again, I think is impressive. For a while, I still think the number one person on this list has the more consistent game as a whole. I think Bayley's game is also very, very impressive here, which is what leaves her here at number 2. Now at number 1. And obviously at this point, it should be pretty clear. At number 1, I do have Anthony. And again, Anthony's game on this season is a tough one to dissect in the sense that obviously he does get to the end and loses in a near unanimous vote in a position where I don't think he could win at the end. I think there's nobody he could probably beat at the end considering the context around the jury, to where, again, that is definitely bad on paper, yet despite that, I still think his game as a whole is very, very impressive. Again, he is obviously coming into this game as a vet, which again has some pros and cons, definitely more pros than cons, and especially considering how this season is structured. Again, Anthony definitely had a pretty decent landing spot in this season, not as good as Victoria, where I think Victoria was really perfectly positioned in this game. Again, being a vet, being in Hot Chocolate, being in the All Women's Alliance, again, having all these alliances pretty much handed to her there, while I feel like Anthony, again, had his relationship with Victoria, along with the fact that obviously the first week was structured in a way that he was always going to have some sort of power during that week, but beyond that was not as well positioned. Obviously, he was someone that was coming into this game looked at as a pretty big threat. Obviously, someone that got all the way to the final 2 the previous time. Now, there were some other benefits in the fact that people looked at him as this honest and loyal player. But also, at the end of the day, I think that also harms his jury perception by the end of the game, with people looking at him as an honest and loyal player when he wasn't one, and were expecting that, to where they're upset at the fact that he wasn't that. So again, it's a double-edged sword there. But obviously, Anthony's the first HOH. I think in a spot where I think his move there to take out Janine is questionable. Obviously, it's one where he is targeting this all-women's alliance and wanted a woman to be gone for sure, though at the same time, I think he's targeting a woman that wanted him safe in the game, someone that did talk about taking Anthony pretty deep into the game, to where targeting Janine in particular during that week, and also creating lies about what Janine supposedly said that just gets exposed for being lies. Again, all that's pretty sloppy play. Like, straight up, again, like, even though I think Anthony plays a pretty dominant game throughout this season, I will not necessarily agree with all of his tactics on this season. I do think this is a move that, again, I think was unnecessary. I do not think this was a spot where he needed to win this HOH at all, even. To where, I mean, at the end of the day, the way the game plays out ends up leading to the women having more power anyway, to where I think he probably would have been better off just giving Spicy the win and trying to maneuver around that. As again, either way, he's involved in the Hot Chocolate Alliance, which is an alliance that obviously very much greatly benefits the all-women power structure. So while he's there and being kept safe by them, he was never an integral number to that group. He was always looked at as the person that was at the bottom of that group, especially considering how much Spicy V was constantly throwing his name out as someone that was such a big threat in the game. So again, it's part of what leads to Donna wanting to target Anthony, to where while that's propped up as a move that was done to protect Anthony in the game, in reality, Spicy V made the decision to make that move before Donna even campaigned against Anthony. And obviously, Anthony put a lot of work that week into making Vivic the target, which, again, he was able to do. Vivic was being targeted for the majority of that week until Spicy V ends up being Spicy V. Like, I think the first of his really great moves on the season comes during the Vivic HOH, where, again, the fact that he's able to convince Vivic to backdoor Dennis is a purely insane move. Again, a really insane play there, and where he's able to convince Vivic that he's in this new alliance with him, Victoria, and Kayla. He's also able to convince Vivic of the fact that he'll be in danger in future rounds due to his connection with Dennis. Like, all that very, very good play. Probably one of his best individual plays up to this point in his Big Brother career, and has even better moves down the road. Though, obviously, his game does start to go downhill over the next few weeks. Again, he does start to lose his own numbers. In a spot where, again, Spicy V had been taking out her own numbers up to this point, again, he does start to lose people when Vivic goes home. Now, technically, he had won the battle during that week, where, again, it was Todd and Tola on the block initially, and he was going to get his way and get Todd out of the game, though obviously that gets stopped by the executive veto twist. And even before that, the target was Bayley. If Bayley went home there, that's also very good for him at this point in the game. But again, executive veto definitely screws him up there. Again, I think he does misplay it a bit. I do think he obviously struggles to maintain Spicy V's loyalty there. And again, that's the spot where Bayley kind of outplays him and gets Vivic on the block. Vivic goes home. Again, bad for his game. Following week, obviously, Matthew goes home. Really bad for his game as well. He's number one ally. And really detrimental spot for him. And also a spot where I think he completely mishandles his relationship with Elijah as well, where, again, Elijah goes out next and it ends up not really mattering that much. But I think it's a spot where he definitely could have picked up Elijah as a number. And again, we see him starting to put the work into that during Elijah's HOH reign, and then never really fully commits to that. And instead, Todd is able to pick up Elijah as a number more so than Anthony, which is, again, is a misplay there. But then we get to probably what is the most impressive individual move he makes on the season in getting Victoria and Avery to turn against Kayla, which, again, is just an insane play there. The fact that he, again, had been putting in work over the last few weeks and souring Kayla's name, but then getting V to believe that Kayla was planning on targeting her. And again, all that really good play, getting Kayla out of the game, upsetting the hot chocolate power structure, which, again, is not a power structure that is beneficial to him. It is weakening Victoria in the game. It's also allowing him to maneuver through the game with his pawns moving forward. All really good play there, and again, further benefited by the fact that he's also able to get Avery out the following week. And again, through all this, also being able to build a relationship with Bayley, which, again, while it is also a very beneficial relationship for Bayley herself, it is also still good for Anthony and giving him more options in the game and allowing him to pull Bayley away from Victoria, as he later does during the final 5 round. Where obviously final 6, again, I think he loses the battle against Bayley there for Victoria's loyalty, again, fails at getting Tola out of the game, and again, him voting for Tola ends up losing him Tola's jury vote, which is really stupid, but whatever. But again, we get to the final 5 where he wins HOH and targets Victoria. And again, this is a move that I think is questionable at this point. I think it's a move that I see the reasons for it needing to happen. I mean, Victoria is someone that is the biggest jury threat at this point in the game. It's also someone that he doesn't trust anymore. Victoria had openly been sewering his name to where, again, I think it makes a lot of sense to get rid of Victoria at this point. However, him being the one to actually do it, I think is a little bit questionable. I think it's a move where, again, like, he should have known Victoria was going to be bitter. I think I could already assume that Victoria was going to be bitter from before this move happened, to where I think that's something that he didn't seem to take into as much consideration as, again, I think the optimal play here would have been to throw this HOH. Again, allow Bayley to win it, and in that spot, again, convince Bayley of making the move. Now, obviously, it's a still very troublesome position to be in, as you're still 100% banking on you being able to convince her of that, where obviously here in this position, he has a lot more control over things as he has safety, and he has the power to nominate. So where, again, like, allowing Bayley to win HOH is really just putting a lot of faith into his social game there, but again, it's a risk that he probably should have took in retrospect. As again, like, by him being the one to take all the brunt of the blame for the Victoria eviction here, he essentially loses the game. And again, it's a spot where, again, Victoria goes into the jury house being so gung-ho, so anti-Anthony, that I think he very much struggles to win the game at that point. Again, I think with Victoria comes Avery and very likely Kayla. I think they very clearly turn Tola against him. But again, I do think he just outright struggles to win the game at that point. So again, his best case scenario at that point is going against Lexus, and even then, I think he loses. They're just being such an anti-Anthony sentiment. But again, on paper, I don't disagree with the move. Again, I think it makes sense to get rid of Victoria. I think it's a spot where if Victoria gets to the end, he auto loses. And I think the fact that he was able to even pull off this move is very impressive. Again, the fact that he was able to convince Bayley and Todd to take out Victoria in a spot where I don't even necessarily think it's in their best interest, it is very impressive play. Now, obviously, again, I think his nomination of Lexus is questionable, where through that, obviously, leaves it open for Lexus to go home. And if Lexus did go home, his game would have been completely sunk at that point. But again, he was able to do very good work in keeping the Victoria plan on. Again, making sure that Bayley and Todd were fully informed on everything that was going on and fully riding out Victoria. And again, it just led to some, again, very impressive play, despite, again, the initial nomination of Lexus is, again, definitely questionable. But then we get to the final 4 where, again, like, it's actually a very precarious spot for Anthony. As, again, I do think Bayley and Todd would have taken out Anthony if they had the choice. Though, again, I don't think that's the best move for them, which, again, makes it even worse for Anthony. But still, he's able to maintain Lexus's loyalty, get Lexus to take him to 3, even though I think it's also a spot where, again, he definitely pushes his luck. He definitely tries to get Lexus to not use the veto, which is a purely insane move there that he should not have tried. But, again, it works out for him. And, again, we get to the final 3 where, obviously, he wins final HOH and makes the wrong move in taking out Lexus. But, again, at the end of the day, I think he loses against both. But again, obviously it's a misread. It's a misread. Him taking Bayley to the end, it shows him not being aware how the jury is thinking, how much the jury loves Bayley and how much they don't like Lexus. So where while again, I think he loses the Lexus, he definitely has a better shot. It's definitely a closer vote. Even though again, I think he still loses the votes of the former hot chocolate plus Tola to where he loses the game anyway. But still, as a whole, again, it's a very impressive game. Again, he has 3 really, really great moves across this season. Again, him tricking Vivic to take out Dennis, him tricking Victoria to take out Kayla, getting Bayley and Todd to take out Victoria. All very impressive moves. And the problem is the fact that he just can't win the game. There is no jury scenario where he wins. And again, it is very much a struggle here on how much to fault him for that. As again, a lot of people will talk about online of like, oh, it's just his ego that made the jury not want to vote for him. When in reality, that isn't the case. I think in reality, it's the fact that Victoria had such a big ego that she didn't want him to win, which again is still a fault on Anthony, as again I do think he should have been aware of the fact that Victoria would be like that, but also I think it's a tough game to play around that. Again, we're in a position where coming into the game, he has a much worse reputation than Victoria. Victoria is not a target by anybody, while Anthony is due to previous reputation. Also the fact that Victoria has a lot more just natural allies on this season, and having the all-women's alliance, having hot chocolate is just completely lock safe coming into the season, to where again it's a struggle to get Victoria out early on in the season. Again, he had to pull out all the stops to get Victoria out at 5 by convincing Bayley and Todd of something that they had been so blind to up to that point. So again, the fact that he was even able to get Victoria out of the game is impressive in its own right. But again, like he pretty much needed Victoria to either not be on the jury at all to proceed to win the game, as either way Victoria would sue her his name, or would need Victoria out at the very, very end to where she wouldn't have enough time with the jury to sue her his name, which I think is also a very tough position to be in, where Via's shown a lot of perpetuity to win these Q&A competitions, where I think she would have been a serious threat to win Final HOH. Again, I think it's a tough spot to be in either way. Now, again, also either way, it wouldn't have mattered as he took Bayley to the end. He would have lost anyway. But again, this is more so discussion around him against the likes of Todd or against Lexus, where again, I think he loses, but again, I think he loses more so due to Spicy V being Spicy V in positions where I don't know how he would have quelled that bitterness. Again, yes, obviously he could have handled Spicy V better on her way out. He could have not yelled at her before she got evicted. He could have played more into what she wanted to hear, that you're the biggest jury threat and that I couldn't beat you. But again, I don't think it would have mattered. She would have been bitter anyway. Again, literally the things that Victoria outlined of how Anthony would have to own his game, and if he did, that she would vote for him. He did that in his final speech, and she still doesn't vote for him. So again, I don't think it would have mattered anyway. I think Spicy V is possibly one of the most bitter jury members in BB history. But really, I think the only solution for Anthony would have been to get her out very early on, which was near impossible, or get her out at the very, very end, which is also very tough to do. To where, again, I think Anthony was in a bad spot throughout a lot of the season to begin with, and despite that bad spot, I think he plays very impressively. Again, like I compared this game to Dan from BB14, and I do very much stand by that. Again, Dan was also in a very tough position. Mind you, I think Dan's jury prospects were less of his fault than Anthony's, where I do think Anthony, again, built this perception of being this loyal player only to completely sink that in a way that does further piss off the jury. Again, him backstabbing people left and right towards the end game and not being able to show really an ounce of loyalty to the jury at the end is definitely a bad perception there. While with Dan, I think a lot of the reason why he loses the game is more so this anti-winner sentiment. There are definitely people were bitter at him for how he maneuvered through the game. I think the reason why he fundamentally loses the game is more so due to that anti-returnee sentiment, where again, I don't think this was because of an anti-returnee sentiment. Again, I think the jury would have easily voted for Victoria if they got into the end. This is purely an anti-Anthony sentiment, which is something that, again, you can argue that he created on his own, though I think he was in a tough spot to where it would have been tough for him to not build that. So considering that, and also just how much influence he had in the game, how much he was not really in a dominant position throughout a decent chunk of the game, but was still able to dominate the game at points, still able to manipulate things to his benefit, to where while, again, he lost battles along the way for sure, I still think as a whole, Anthony played a very impressive game, had a more consistent game than Bayley in my mind, to where, again, I do think it is actually relatively close, especially considering Bayley's massive win equity, though I think at the end of the day, I do come down to the fact that I just think Anthony's more consistent game is enough to land him here at number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my player ranking for BB Can 12, which again wraps up my coverage for BB Can 12. Now moving forward, obviously I'll be back for BB Can 13 if we get it. Well, obviously we'll be back for Big Brother US in a few months. We obviously have a lot of shows currently going on that I'll be doing videos on, like The Amazing Race 36, Survivor 46, Challenge All Stars 4. In terms of BB Can videos, again, I'll be doing an updated winner ranking at some point between now and the next season, so stay tuned for all those things. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.